So I'm Abby Tissot. I'm the Assistant Dean of Admissions for the UC College of Medicine, meaning that I make all the selections for people who become physicians. So that's what my daily job is. Prior to doing that, though, I was a researcher and a clinician at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and I was recruited to Cincinnati for that specific purpose. That being the case, one of the things I have a lot of experience with is how to help people convey their research in ways that are effective and efficient. And I actually loved hearing your announcements because the fact that you're all being forced to give your research sort of output in a very accelerated format means that hopefully what I'm going to talk with you about will be even more handy. I guess first I would like to know though, generally, the research that you're doing, could you just kind of like rattle off the general topic for me? And again, this is a challenge because I'm asking you to do it quickly. Rattle off, right?
Okay, what we're doing is we're trying to sequence the DNA of the bacteria that live in cockroaches.
Ooh.
I'm cloning little DNA sequences into viral vectors, and we're seeing if it has transcription factors for lupus.
Awesome.
We're trying to see if there's a difference in the matrix of DNA between regions on the knee cartilage. Not DNA. Did I say DNA?
You said DNA, yeah.
Matrix. The matrix of the cartilage.
Gotcha.
We're trying to insert microRNA to cause apoptosis in prostate cancer cells.
Fantastic.
We're examining the effects of like repetitive ischemic attacks on like the mice for pollen.
Yeah.
We're trying to determine the effectiveness of different novel drugs that inhibit acute myeloid leukemic cells.
Yep. Okay, good.
We're trying to use gene therapy as a treatment for sickle cell and thalassemia.
Fantastic.
We're trying to use microRNAs to help regulate controlling seizures and stopping neuronal death and epilepsy.
Wow.
We're trying to see if other has a microRNA has anything to do with glucose metabolism in the liver.
Very cool.
We are studying the effect that an area the child grows up in has on the severity of their asthma.
Ooh, multivariate. Got it. Okay. All right. So the reason I asked you that as our starting point is that usually when somebody casually asks you to give an idea about your research, you're able to do that, right? It's this and that. Why is it different when you're put up in a position of presenting your research to fellow peers, to other scholars, in an academic setting? Why is it somewhat easier to do what you just did than it is to be brief when you're speaking about the research in a scholarly context? Anybody?
You have a lot more detail to convey when you're doing it in a scholarly sense.
Absolutely. There's more detail. What else?
It feels like you're under more pressure because it's not as casual of a setting.
Absolutely. The pressure is an awful lot higher. There's an evaluative component, right? As I sit here and ask you this, you're sort of like, oh yeah, well let me just kind of give you a brief idea, right? But when you're up there, you actually know that you're being evaluated. There are important people around you, so you want to sort of seem more capable. That's also a contributor. So those things all play into how you behave as a presenter of research. And one of my favorite things is that I always tell people that a lay summary is something you should know about. And if you haven't heard of a lay summary, this is what it is. Here's what a lay summary really is. In every grant you write, in every public outlet that puts your research on the front page, in every elevator conversation that you have with somebody about your research, you are essentially offering a lay abstract. And lay abstract really does mean that when you are giving the details of your research, you are being brief and you are using words that should be familiar to everybody. A lay abstract is actually incredibly challenging. And the reason a lay abstract is hard is because you're asked to take out all of the scholarly bits and pieces, which are the pieces that make you feel really good about research, right? I used to do sort of neurotransmitters and sort of gut peptides related to anorexia nervosa. And if I went someplace and I'm talking about anorexia nervosa, the first thing I want to do is start using words that make you think I understand what I'm talking about, right? I'm going to start throwing out these words that make you think, ooh, and ah, listen to her, she knows what she's saying. Which assays did you run? And sort of what was your meal paradigm and all this other kind of stuff. And I get up there and I want to do that because right away I want to impress you and I want to make you think that I know what I'm talking about. The problem is, by doing that, there are probably two narcissists in the population of people that I'm usually speaking to, two people who want to be convinced that I'm capable. Everybody else just wants to learn about what I'm talking about. And when I enter a room and I start throwing out terms, jargon as it were, I've lost all of the rest of the people in the audience who could be my collaborators and various other things. So a lay abstract is not intuitive. It's not what you think you want to do, but it's exactly what you need to do if the goal of your presentation is to inform people, to create collaborations, to make people believe that you know what you're talking about. So it's a summary, which is brief, of your research project. Essentially, it's to be read by people in the public, not people who have intimate knowledge of what you're doing. And it also is supposed to be free of jargon. That's really challenging. If I had told you don't talk about DNA or matrix or anything like that when you were to provide me an overview of your research, that would be a challenge, right? How do you describe what you're doing without using those technical terms? And your initial reaction is, don't tell me not to use those terms. I'm going to use those terms so I sound smart and capable. And I'll try to explain to you how it actually works against you to do that. So, a scientific abstract. Here's a good example. The text is tiny, but you're young, so you can probably read it. I think when you start to read what this is saying, you can initially see that if you're not intimately aware of prostate cancer or those types of processes, which there was one person in here who was doing prostate stuff. Who was that? Yes, excellent. So she's going to be all about this scientific abstract, but the rest of you might not be. So this is sort of typically what a scientific abstract looks like. It leaves a good number of people in the audience sort of wondering exactly what it is. They're also trying to deduce from the context exactly what you're talking about, right? This is a lay abstract. First of all, you can see from the length that it's quite different. But you should also be able to tell from the language that it's simpler. I'll give you a little bit to read that. The reality is, for this particular abstract, you're still speaking to a scientific audience, right? There are still words in there that are rather scientific. When I write grants to the NIH, do people here know what the NIH is? Yes, it's shrinking, it's disappearing, but it's a thing that we used to have. When we write grants, we actually are required to provide a lay abstract. And the lay abstract we provide is a little bit more like this. It's an abstract that includes some scientific language because it's being interpreted by other scientists in the exact same content area. Okay? But a lay abstract like this is still not the kind of abstract that I typically have to use on a daily basis. If I'm talking to gastroenterologists, or if I'm talking to neurologists, or if I'm talking to biostatisticians, or whoever I'm talking to, I use a different lay abstract. So, if I might just ask you quickly, when you are doing your presentations about your grant projects, who are you speaking to? Who's your audience? Anyone? Each other? Right. Yes, and?
And our mentors.
And your mentors. And they might have a centrality of training in science, right? And research. But other than that, they're pretty varied, pretty diverse, right? Different disciplines, different backgrounds, different institutions that they work in. So when you're doing your presentations, you should be starting with the idea of who am I speaking to? How can I make sure that my lay abstract is understandable to the most people in that room as possible? And here's the other hard part. You basically have to do what we do when we put out any kind of a press release. You also have to titrate it down to a set reading level, or to a set understandable level. And that level is not the median, or the average in the room, but it's actually the lowest in the room. So when you're preparing to present your research, you actually need to start with one another as your audience, not your mentors. Is that what you've already been thinking? Totally, right? I'm totally telling you things you already knew. Maybe, yes, no? No. Usually people start with mentors. And so what I'm asking you to do is to really start with one another. And the reason for that is all of you are there to hear one another. Most of the mentors are there to hear their mentees, and a little bit more from everybody else. But you really have to make sure that your peers understand. So if you understand exactly how a lay abstract works, really what ultimately you're doing is looking at this. You're basically thinking that most people are going to only read the abstract. That's the way research works. When you're writing a grant even, this is the dirty secret, I bet your mentors would tell you the same. You don't pull out the entire article. You start with a lit search and all of the abstracts. And there are certain articles that you use just the abstract, right? When I do press releases, anorexia is kind of a big area of interest to people, and so lots of magazines and USA Today and places like that want to pick up the research. When I send something out, I know the headline is all that's going to be read. That's almost a lay abstract. So you really have to realize that most of the time, what I'm asking you to produce in your future scientific careers is going to be the first thing and potentially the only thing that most people read about your work. You should also know that the lay abstract really should tell people why your research is being suggested or why it's happening. A very simplistic statement about why you're even doing this. It should also basically tell you what you were aiming to achieve. And these are little bitty quick points. You should also be talking about how this might impact the rest of the research community. So it shouldn't just be how it affects other prostate cancer researchers, or in my case, other people investigating anorexia. You should be able to talk about it more broadly and its impact on the scientific community, because if you're too narrow, other people can't really pick up and enjoy your research. And then finally, you really want to speak to why somebody who is a non-researcher or not in your scientific area should listen to you. Because otherwise, they're counting down the seconds until their student's coming up to speak, right? Because you've already started to use too much jargon and not really connected them, or sort of set the line, as they say in fishing, to sort of get the person involved in what you're doing. Is this making sense? All right. This is usually the why. So the reason that we do it is it describes your research to a broader audience, and that's important. Just so you all know, even just in my lifetime, and I consider myself relatively junior in our world and sort of the medical research community, I'm very junior, but we have seen a vast change in funding. If any of you want to do research, how many of you think you might do research in some capacity in your careers? Okay, so some. How many of you think you might be sort of consulted in research, or maybe, I don't know, an external collaborator of some sort? Outside of that? Okay, so mostly you're either going to do research or not. When you think about the work that you're doing, most of the time you want people to understand what you're doing from a scientific point of view and a non-scientific point of view. My example would be Cosmopolitan magazine. Anybody ever heard of Cosmo magazine? Is that still a thing? So with Cosmo magazine, they're almost always picking up research studies, and they're doing them as a sort of a drop in the bucket. This is a little bit gross and a little bit crude, but it's a laugh sort of article that we use a lot in the College of Medicine. Did you ever hear about the article, the headline, that sort of smelling one's own flatulence could be beneficial for cancer treatment? That was an actual article. That's something that was actually published. It was then picked up by USA Today, Good Morning America, all within the last year. Anybody who heard that headline thought to themselves, there's no way that somebody actually did a rigorous study investigating flatulence and cancer treatment. That's unlikely. And yet, it splashed all over the news outlets, and ultimately they all had to retract those headlines because they had so badly misrepresented the research. When you actually look at what happened, what had occurred was that the original researchers who had done it had put out a lay abstract that had sort of been too technical. And because of the way it was written, the news outlets had sort of deduced what they could and then splashed it all across their various outlets. So you also have to remember that there are always going to be people who are non-researchers who are consuming your research. And they are going to be the kinds of people who are trying to spread it out to a broader audience. And so you have to be really good at lay abstracts to make sure that you don't end up in the same sort of situation as people whose research is badly misrepresented, and then you're having to retract your own statements. It also builds collaboration skills. Like a lay abstract, being able to do that puts you in a situation where other people realize that you can boil it down to a common denominator, that you can convey to them something simple and straightforward. And it promotes funding potential. As I mentioned, the NIH has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk over the last 30 years. You used to be able to have big research studies and lots of them, and one after another after another. These days you're lucky if you have one. Moreover, these days if you do have one research study and one grant funded, it's likely that you have 3 investigators on that study, and they represent vastly different areas of research. So if you're going to build those types of collaborations, you need to be able to communicate in a way that's straightforward and that brings people to an understanding of what your impact, your relevance, and your applicability of the research is. This is probably my most important slide, and I can tell you guys are pretty pooped, so I'm going to try to just engage you with this one really quickly. Who knows what parroting is? Anybody ever heard of parroting? What do parrots sound like? When they talk, what kinds of things do they say? Do they have novel ideas?
No.
No. How have they learned to speak? What are they doing?
Copying the way you say.
Exactly, right? You're basically feeding them lines, right? And they learn it and they regurgitate. And it's kind of a fun process. You're like teaching the parrot, but the parrot's really just sort of singing a song. And one of the things that I tend to see, especially in our College of Medicine, is young people who are coming in and presenting research, and they are parroting. So what would parroting be? Now we've determined what a parrot sounds like. What do you think parroting is in the context of research?
They're just saying like all the key phrases that they hear all the time, I suppose.
Absolutely. They know the buzzwords. They've heard their PI say a few things. They've heard the postdoc say a few things. They kind of know the lines, right? And so what they ultimately do is they don't speak about their research so much as they just parrot phrases. How can you tell if a person is parroting? Have you ever been in a situation where you've heard a person parrot, even if it's not about research, where you've heard a person parrot things? Does it sound convincing? Can you sort of initially determine if a person is producing content that they aren't really sure about? Do you have a sense? Do you get kind of like a glimmer of like, oh, if I ask a deeper question, this person's probably not going to be able to answer it? It's actually really transparent. I often say that if you've ever talked with a person about, oh, this place was super cool, I went here, I stayed in this city, yada yada, and then you ask additional questions about that place, like how many days did you stay there? Oh, well, we were there for like 2 days. You were able to see all of those neighborhoods in 2 days? Well, no, but I mean, people were talking about, like as soon as you start to ask questions, it sort of unravels. So parroting is the first thing that I see, especially in young researchers, that is initially very identifiable. It undermines your credibility, and it's something that you're all prone to do. I think probably the first rant presentation I ever came to, that was the reason that I offered to do this, was because I was there to support students, I thought it was really awesome, and the work was incredible. And I felt so bad for the students because they didn't know that they were parroting, and they could have been so much more convincing, they could have shown so much more ownership of their work, but I think they were too afraid. And usually people parrot when they're afraid. It's safer if I use these words than if I actually try to talk about it in a lay manner. What is jargon?
Jargon's like the advanced or technical terms that are used just within the industry.
Absolutely. So it's industry speak, right? There's so much of that. If you ever talk with somebody, I'm trying to think, what is it, the 5 Six Sigma? Anybody here in business or new people in business? There's a language, I think it's Six Sigma, and it's got this whole dictionary. It's just like a whole jargon notebook about sort of how you speak. And if you're talking with a person from that background, sometimes they just throw all that language out and you're trying to follow, and you need a guide or a key. And so jargon can be just as dangerous as parroting, because essentially you're just leaving everybody in the dust because they can't follow your exact language. One other thing, playing pretend. When it comes to an academic setting, what do you think I mean by playing pretend? Playing pretend. Scientific setting, academic setting. What would people be pretending about?
Acting like you weren't a student researcher on the project, like you were something more.
Fantastic. Almost sort of an ownership level that's not yours. And how do you think your PIs might feel if you are up there sort of acting like it's your project? Thoughts?
Not happy.
Not happy, right? It might be a little bit of a punch in the gut, as it were. You know that you've done all of this work, this is your life's work, and that you've carved out this project and you're helping a student with, and they're up there acting, sort of showboating, but acting like they've done all of this themselves. As a PI, knowing that you're doing this out of service, that you just want to help students, that would feel pretty awful. So a lot of people, a lot of students present their research using these sort of 3 critical errors, and they do it not out of an intent to overstate or to avoid or to sort of snow other people, but ultimately that's what they do. And so finally, at the conclusion of your presentation, not only have you not conveyed any information to your peers, but you also have looked as though maybe you didn't know what you were talking about. And finally, there's a solid chance you might have even insulted a mentor, accidentally. Effective presentation? Not so much, yeah? So here's why a lay abstract is needed, because in order to avoid these kinds of things, not only to make your research accessible, but also to avoid these critical errors, you really need to be able to perform a lay abstract. So here's the how. I know I've been talking about it a lot in the whys, but here's what you do. So you basically think about writing something like you would for Cosmo magazine, or for USA Today, or something like that. You essentially start with a title, you make it catchy and simple. You go to the background, sort of a quick sentence covering the current state of the evidence. You discuss what your aims were, right? Why were you doing this research, basically? How will it affect people? And then, as simply as you can, state your methods. And honestly, even though you're used to having very complicated methods, in this particular setting, you do not need highly refined, detailed, operationalized procedures. In this setting, you're going to do just what you did at the beginning of the session. You're going to get the broadest discussion of what your methods were. Finally, you give your results, either the expected outcomes or your actual outcomes. If you're lucky enough to be completed with your project, you'll have real ones. And you sort of end up with a practical application. It's that simple. Ultimately, this is a lay abstract, but it's also better known as an elevator speech. It's simple. It's straightforward. It's all of the bits and pieces, and yet it's very fluid. And the most important thing is that once you actually are able to do this, break it down into these parts, when you're like walking by somebody and you both get into the elevator together and the person's like, oh, hey, it's good to see you here. What are you up to these days? You can quickly say, blah, 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 blah. A little lay abstract, a little elevator speech. It's super quick, and they're able to connect with you. At Children's Hospital in particular, the elevators, have you guys ever been over there? Anybody been to Children's? Okay. Okay, good. So there are massive elevator bays. You've seen those? In the clinical areas as well as in the research areas. You would not believe how much time is spent on elevators connecting with one another about one another's research. You leave grand rounds. Anybody know what grand rounds are? Grand rounds are like educational seminars, essentially, where you come together and you talk about a specific medical topic, different every single week. And basically everybody comes and you sit and you listen to that session. And then everybody leaves at the same time. So you have people coming from nephrology and hepatology and all of these different places, immunology, pathology, we're all in the same places. We've all listened to the same talk. Now we're all rushing back to our offices, and it's the only time all of the groups are intermingling. So in the elevators, people are all just swapping what they're doing. Oh, what are you doing these days? Blah, blah, blah. Quick and easy. You've only got 2 to 3 floors to get this all out, right? So it's not just a lay abstract. It's also an elevator speech. So just for your background information, basically when we say you want to develop one of these, I always remind people that your best bets for making sure that an elevator speech or a lay abstract works is actually to think about, to sort of adjust it to information that your family members would understand, and in particular maybe your grandparents. Your grandparents are very young compared to my grandparents, but you still think about grandparent understanding. If the extent of their scientific knowledge is the nightly news, could they understand what you just said? Also, think about high school students. If you were talking to a high school student, you remember when you were high school students? Do you remember how much you knew? A lot less than now, right? Would a high school student be able to follow your content? And if that's too hard to think about family members and high school students, just think about your friends, your peers who are non-science majors. Would they be able to follow? If you have constructed a lay abstract and you can't achieve an understanding from any of these 3 groups, it's not a lay abstract. Is that making sense? Arguments. I like arguments. Clarifications. Dismay. Come on. There are always people who are like, come on, this is not really what people do. We really do this. I want to assure you of that. I would not come and tell you to do something we don't do. But are there any ways that you're looking at this thinking like this can't really be helpful, or even maybe that it would only be helpful if it were done a different way? I'm from a scientific background. We actually welcome disagreement, argument, clarification. I know that's different than being over here in an educational setting, maybe more where the professor knows the right answer, but clarifications? Everybody feeling okay about this? All right, I promise you're going to do it, which is maybe not even more fun, but we'll have you set up to do this with one another. I also just want to give you a few tips when you're thinking about an elevator speech or a lay abstract. And the first one is don't use any abbreviations. We use a lot of acronyms, right? Medical research has a whole lot of acronyms. I mean, there are times where you can look at an entire abstract and it's almost all acronyms. You don't want to use any of those. So try your very hardest to not use those types of abbreviations. And any information that would usually be implied or that you would just assume is understood, you're not allowed to have that. You basically have to make sure that the things that you're saying are just very clear, no implicit knowledge. And most importantly, that you need to avoid jargon. So if you're going to use certain terms and you're going to start speaking a certain way, you almost have to stop yourself from using that standard sentence that you tend to use and think about whether or not it makes sense on its own or if you need to use different words to describe it. And a good example would be a ramp student last year. I'm trying to think, maybe it was cloning actually. And instead of saying cloning, the person stopped himself and then came up with another way of saying what cloning was. And why is that? It's again because cloning is jargon. Even though we're used to hearing it, it actually is jargon. What does that really mean? What are you really doing? Right? Anybody? What is cloning actually? I think one of you is doing some cloning. Anybody? Anything?
And just replicating something over and over again.
Absolutely. Replicating something over and over again. And replicating, I don't know, some high school students might get that, some might not. Grandparents might get it, some might not. So what is replicating really meaning? Copying, right? It's like taking it all the way back there. Can you each, please, provide me with one word from your research, except for you because you already did cloning, one word from your research that you're used to using that you would actually have to state in a simpler way? And because I started over there the first time, I'm going to start over here this time.
One of the ones my mentor was talking about was we use biomarkers, and we're trying to identify biomarkers. And then when we're in research visits with families and we're trying to explain that to them, we describe it as like kind of the way like cell phones communicate with each other. So we're looking for how cells are able to communicate, whether that's by text message or phone call. Those biomarkers are like those chemical signals.
That's fabulous. Chemical telephone calls or chemical text messages. Awesome. Cool.
We talk a lot about like microRNA. So we just we haven't really spoken about any patients or anything.
Yeah.
So we haven't really had to avoid all the jargon, but we just try to simplify it as like solid communications or like any type of ways for like the RNA to communicate rather than getting into like the specific actual names.
Great. So the only check is that you say RNA again, and then we're like, oh, so now we have to get RNA out of there. So you see how it's just like a rabbit hole? You just kind of keep finding different levels of what you're used to saying. But again, communicating is a common theme. You guys are basically able to describe what you're doing as communicating. Excellent.
I guess one term we use a lot is EEGs, which
Yeah.
is, so basically we're looking at recordings of the mouse's brain.
Nice. Excellent. Well done.
So we say gene therapy a lot.
Yeah.
So I guess if I were to simplify that, it'd be kind of like finding a way to replace bad genes with good ones.
Nice. Well done.
We use AML a lot, so if
Yep.
you myeloid leukemia,
Yep.
instead of that I could just say cancer or something's wrong with your blood.
Exactly. A specific kind of blood cancer, right? Yeah. Nice. Well done.
We use ischemia reperfusion, so just loss of blood flow and then the return of blood flow.
Yes. Well done. Yeah. And that's really nice too because that's one of those words that's like so very specific, ischemic. You know, it's like, what is that? People outside of cardiology might not know.
Yeah.
Good.
We use transfection a lot, so it's just putting small pieces of DNA, so informational material, into cells.
Nice. Yeah, almost like a little transplant.
We had that heavy focus on cartilage matrix.
Yeah.
Can I use the word cell? Is that commonly understood enough, or does that?
I would say if you think your grandparents and a high school student would get it, which they probably would.
I'd hope so.
Yeah, but I think cell's safe. Yeah.
It's basically just the proteins and fluid around the cells.
Nice. Well done. That's good.
We use immunofluorescence a lot, so I would say just like sticking a glow-in-the-dark post-it note on a certain type of molecule so that you can see it clearly.
That's fabulous, especially because it's very, very illustrative, very easy to see. Nice. All right, so you got to go last. We need some space, some time.
I do a lot of extractions, so I guess I would say like, you know, if I have a cockroach, what steps do I have to do to get just the DNA? I guess.
But what's the DNA?
Informational material.
Absolutely, out of the cockroach, right? People are like, are you waterboarding the cockroach? What are you doing? You're like, no. Cell stuff, right? Like body stuff. Yeah, body information. Cool. All right, good. So basically, that's what you need to do, but on a really minute level. Because what I've just asked you to do is take one central idea out of your research. The problem is that basically everything you're used to saying is done in this very dense, very jargon-filled way. So I have just an example up here, basically of an abstract. If you wouldn't mind, it's a little bit bigger, so give it a read.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the one, we'll take a step back. You said it was important to, first off, know your audience.
Mm-hmm.
So if I know my audience in this proposal,
Yeah.
can I understand that for like the purpose of if I'm gonna submit or publish something, I would want to have a certain vocabulary, but for the purpose of the presentation, would it be safe to assume that everyone there would understand what DNA means?
It's a great question. So what I would challenge you with is that there are other people doing research on areas where they understand what DNA is by concept, right?
Mhm.
But they might not understand how your research on DNA is working if you describe it just generally as something with DNA. Do you know what I mean? Like, so if you use word X on DNA, then it's not really going to help the other people in the room. So if you believe that everybody is intimately aware of the DNA process that you are using, or the type of information on the DNA that you're interested in, then absolutely use the sort of general term. But if it's a wider range of individuals, and even when I'm thinking about something in the biomarker research, those are individuals who aren't going to be maybe as familiar with some of the DNA concepts that you might introduce later. So think about the additional concepts you'll be introducing and make sure that you're not, it's that implicit knowledge issue, right? That the way that you're talking about DNA means that they're going to understand it fully. It's sort of like if you get down to the point of like, you know, certain bits of DNA, and you predicated the prior portion on saying, okay, everybody understands DNA, okay, but here are the little pieces. Well, that's fine, study DNA, but then talk about the little pieces. But if your real work is sort of with DNA at large, you probably need to get a little bit more information about why you're doing what you're doing. And that means not just saying DNA. Does that make sense at all? Okay. I know it's difficult because it's so varied, but I think just as a general example, this was an example of how it was sort of modified or reduced. And I think what you also have to realize is that people struggle with these lay abstracts. It's not just you, it's everybody. And so ultimately, what I'm going to have you do is with yourselves in pairs, you're going to try to do a quick lay abstract about your research. This is essentially your first attempt to make your research reduced into like a 30-second to 2-minute package. So one of the things that I just want you to know is that outside of the details I've just mentioned, it is a good idea to use an active voice, not a passive voice. What's the difference between an active or a passive voice? Anybody know?
That you have a subject doing the verb.
Exactly. Passive means that there's something happening, right? Active means you're doing it. So make sure that you're active. Try to use 25 words-ish, which is crazy hard, and I'll often tell people to like use their fingers, so 25 words at a time. That's really difficult. You kind of work through your hands twice or so. Make sure that you're thinking about what your wow factor is, like why should somebody care? Everybody is there and they want to hear things that are interesting, so engage them, help get them engaged. Give context and examples if you're able to, and remember, you kind of keep counting to 25 words. After time, the 25 words is helping you limit, but try to give context and examples if there's something that you can explain. Telephone and text messages was a great example. You know, if there's a way to contextualize it so that the person can broadly understand. And I always tell people that if you hear jargon when you're working in your pair, you have to give a sign. And the sign is this. That's the sign that jargon just happened. So, as you're sitting there listening to your partner, I know that it's difficult, but when you hear a jargon word, you just do this. And the person has to stop, hop back, and choose a different word. If you don't alert the person to jargon, what happens? You keep rattling through, going through your lines, parroting the information that you've heard, and you aren't helping one another. By the time that person goes up there to present their research, they're going to be full of jargon. So what is the universal sign for a jargon word? Let's see it. Nice, exactly. All right, so also just wanted to remind you that you really don't want to be the person who is the know-it-all. That's why we're doing this, right? And so you also don't want to be the person who uses overly complex words when simpler ones will do, right? Here are a couple of examples. I mean, like cell, for instance. Yes, we could all use the word cell, right? But if you really think about it, the basic structural, functional, and biological unit of all living organisms, that's really what it is, right? So if you boil yourself back to the general idea and not just kind of punk out by using a word to catch it all, you're actually helping yourself think about your research a little bit differently. Same with apoptosis, right? How cells die. Cell death. I mean, think about the difference between cell death and apoptosis. That's kind of cool when you really think about what you can do with 2 words, cell death, to capture 1 word, and yet it's so much more understandable. Those are just general ideas about being the kind of person that when you're saying things, the other individual listening has a way to understand it. Even if they can understand the concept, make it easier for them, they'll be more interested and they'll think you're smarter. Because it's a lot harder to boil things down into a lay form than it is to just rattle off jargon. These are a couple of other words, just again, easy. Duration is always one of my favorites, the number of times you see duration. It's just the amount of time, right? This research will inform, yes, it will inform, but it's really just saying it's going to tell us what's happening. For the purpose of, I mean, look how many words, 4 words, it's really just 2, T-O, 1 word. So there are a lot of ways where I'm asking you to make some words longer, but there are other ones that you can make much shorter. Is that making sense? Okay. All right, so here's what we do. You sort of start here. Give yourself a catchy, simple sentence that gives you the overall outline of what your research is doing. Where do things stand? What do you want to do? Why is it important? I put these into sentence form. It's the same information I showed you earlier, just this way it's a little bit easier to get you started. How will you do it? What do you expect to happen? And how can this be used by the public? By doing this, by giving one another an alert when it's jargon, and by keeping track of your words to try to limit your words, you'll actually, hopefully, be a more effective talker. So, pairs. I don't know if you guys are okay to just sort of create pairs. Yes? And then do you want to work with me? I know it's not a whole lot of fun, but okay. All right, so if you guys don't mind pairing up and just giving it a call or giving it a try, you're going to do one to the other, and you are going to give each other feedback once you finish, and then the other to the other partner, give feedback, okay?